Hi, welcome everyone to our next OXBC Spotlight podcast, videocast, vlog, and Stop the Press. We have with us Jim Needham, who is the Global Vice President and Head of Digital Assets for the MERJ Exchange Seychelles. Jim, thank you for joining us.
Hello, Rupert. Hello, Clemens.
Good.
And also, obviously, a cornerstone and pillar and foundation of the Oxford Blockchain Foundation.
The esteemed Oxford Blockchain Foundation.
Exactly, and approximately. Jim, I thought it'd be good. We thought it'd be good to hear a little bit about your background before we hear about security tokens and MERJ and the Seychelles and all those good things.
Mm-hmm.
Where did it all start for you? And is it true that you live on the Riviera?
Right. Okay, I'll give you a bit of background about myself. So I did a law degree at university. I left and went to work in the city. I started as an investment banker and ended up spending about 17 years within primary and secondary capital markets in London. And around 3 years ago, we'd had some children, my wife and I, and we had basically London wasn't the place for us anymore. We wanted to move. We wanted to move to the country, bring the girls up in the countryside, and so we made a fairly sort of on the spot decision. We sold I left my job, and we bought a bit of land down in Devon and moved down here, and we built a house, which was a great experience. But whilst doing that, in the background, I was getting more and more interested in what I was reading in the papers about Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and I knew that I was extremely ignorant on the whole subject, really, and made more and more of an effort to get to educate myself. I spent a lot of time Googling and YouTubing, and didn't really get very far. So I think probably as a result of all the Googling and YouTubing, I was getting adverts for the Oxford Blockchain course. And I got sucked in, did the Oxford Blockchain course, absolutely loved it, learned a lot that I didn't know. And that was the start of my journey into blockchain, really.
I remember when you came to our first meetup, back in, I don't know what it was, January 2018, and you arrived, and clearly you'd come up from the country because you were wearing a great big barber jacket, and I'd asked if some people could help bring some drinks, and you pulled out from the huge pockets of your barber jacket about 15 cans of craft beer. So I was thinking, yeah, it's only jackets like that come up from the countryside. But the other thing that we heard about your background was that you were strategically involved in the collapse of Enron. Is that right?
I did spend I spent about 9 months working at Enron, actually, as a very young man, which I have to say was a tremendous experience. It was a place that was really in the ascendancy at the time. I was working in the electricity derivatives trading business. And it was the envy of the world, honestly, it really was. And all the guys who ran that team have now gone on to big jobs at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and hedge funds. But there were other things going on at Enron which we weren't privy to, which seemingly didn't work out so well.
You were clearly in the right office at the wrong time.
It was honestly, it was a really it was an exciting place to work, and it was very like cutting edge. They were trying to do things like get futures going for internet bandwidth, and they were doing some really interesting stuff. This was back in like '99. So.
Yeah, they would have loved the ICO craze, that's for sure.
They would have done, yeah, they really would have done.
So talking of creative, novel, and exciting places to work, what's going on now?
So I am now working at MERJ Exchange, which is a securities exchange based in the Seychelles, which I know you're familiar with because I've hit you on the topic a number of times. But most people, or I dare say a fair few listeners won't be familiar with it. Would you like me to go into a little bit of detail?
Well, I'll tell you what. Start on the basis of clarifying what that means in layman's terms, in terms of what this exchange can achieve and why it's different to a crypto exchange and how exchanges work. Because I think that will then possibly open up why it might be valuable and interesting.
So MERJ is a recognized securities exchange. It's what's defined in financial services speak as a regulated market. So that is what the London Stock Exchange is, or the New York Stock Exchange. People get a bit alarmed when they hear that it's regulated out of the Seychelles, but you could substitute Seychelles for Dublin or Luxembourg. It's the same regulatory principles, which all stem from IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissions. That's the regulatory framework. We're a member of the World Federation of Exchanges. So we are, even though the location geographically is the Seychelles and we're regulated via the Seychelles regulator, it's the same standards and regulatory principles as most of the big stock exchange groups that you are familiar with for the listing and trading of securities. Now, the benefit of being a stock exchange of that status is when things get listed on a regulated market, they have a sort of automatic bump of their status as a security, and that's because the barrier, the due diligence, the regulatory burden of listing on a securities exchange like this is high enough that it makes regulators around the world more comfortable with it. It's the concept of a publicly listed security. So that gives you great advantages when it comes to distributing it to a wider investor base. So it fits into institutional investment mandates, for example, and you can sell it more. It's a easier thing to get into the hands of the full spectrum of investors, from retail up to institutional. So that is the sort of exchange MERJ is. It was started in 2011 as the domestic stock exchange for the Seychelles. It has evolved into more of an international listing venue, partly because it's a small market and it was a relatively late market to evolve, relative to, say, London, which started, I think, in 1801. Because it was a small market and it started quite late, it also has the licenses for clearing and settling securities in a registered clearinghouse, and the licenses for a securities depository, or CSD. So that's quite an unusual combination, and it's what's described as vertical integration. It means you can not only list and trade securities, you can also clear, settle, and register them within one organization, which is quite unusual. It's the same structure as SIX in Switzerland and a few others, the ASX in Australia, B3 Bolsa, I think, in Brazil. But most exchanges, like London as an example, has London LSE as the stock exchange, ClearNet as the clearing layer, and Crest as the depository layer. So that's three organizations, three tech stacks, different regulators, and the great advantage MERJ has is that we are one organization with one tech stack and one regulator. So when it came to the conversation of supporting digital securities, tokenized securities, that's a much more straightforward thing to implement because you've got far fewer people to get to agree. So that conversation began with our regulator in 2016, and it was actually June of this year that it was approved that we could use our existing securities infrastructure to support tokenized securities. And at the moment, MERJ is the only recognized stock exchange globally that has that permission and that infrastructure. So that's what's quite exciting. Does that kind of set the scene?
So what will the benefits of that be? Does that mean you can settle a trade at that instantaneously at the point you make it, or what are the upsides?
It's a bit like saying that London Stock Exchange now supports tokenized securities within its end-to-end infrastructure. So you could trade everything you could trade through London. You could do the same thing with tokenized securities. Now, it's MERJ is a sort of tropical, smaller equivalent of the LSE, effectively. So contrast that, to answer your question, to contrast that with a crypto exchange, there are no institutions, no professional counterparties around the world that will trade against a crypto exchange because the counterparty risks and the compliance risks are too high. They will trade, obviously, with the London Stock Exchange or an exchange of that caliber, i.e. MERJ. So we can give access to the digital securities market to the full spectrum of institutional investors. And that access point, other than MERJ, doesn't really exist at this point in time.
On a question around MERJ, does it speak to a certain audience of company, like, I don't know, SPVs or funds? Lots of these exchanges, carve themselves a niche which they focus on. Is MERJ doing that, or is it quite general?
So I think historically the listing venue would have been aimed at that sort of entity. I mean, there are the traditional listings have been things like the insurance companies in the Seychelles or hotel groups in the Seychelles, but also it's a good venue for what we would call technical listings, which might be SPVs or funds, things which are listed for the distribution benefits rather than for the liquidity benefits. But now that we're moving, so that the exchange has sort of evolved into a global platform, and actually the way that capital markets are evolving is that people are looking for opportunities all over the world, not just in their local market. And what the blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology enables us to do is simplify that kind of cross-border process. So it's a very useful tool for facilitating a global listing venue and exchange. But when you start to dig into the opportunities for the sorts of assets that you can tokenize, all sorts of interesting things come up. And that could be, it could be rare cars, it could be paintings, it could be music rights, it could be authorship rights. There's all sorts of interesting new assets that could potentially be tokenized and listed on MERJ at a price point that makes sense, and then have the same distribution possibilities as if they were listed on Deutsche Börse or London Stock Exchange.
And talking about price point, not mentioning numbers, but as a percentage, but how much less does it cost to, let's say, list on MERJ compared to AIM in London?
So I think probably a tenth.
Yeah. Okay.
It's probably a tenth.
That's substantial.
And it's probably to list on London Stock Exchange is probably 2.5 times what it would cost to list on AIM. So that gives you an idea of the quantum of price difference.
Okay.
So what do you see happening with MERJ's story over the next 12 months, 18 months? Where is this going? Because this is very nascent, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we're at the cutting edge, really. There is no securities exchange globally that has listed a equity token or a digital token other than MERJ. So it's definitely early days in the book on this, but I think where it's going to go at the moment, there's a sort of, I think the last few years, the institutions have been reluctant to participate in this market because maybe some of the infrastructure hasn't been there. And there was, timing wise, the sort of collapse of the ICO craze of 2017 has sort of tainted the tokenization story a little bit. But I think now the infrastructure is starting to be there. We provide infrastructure that even the most demanding institutional mandates would be happy with. I think you're going to see more and more institutions start to come into this market, and there are more and more institutionally focused products being created. There's a very interesting product that CoinShares have developed with blockchain.com, and Globacap, which is its ownership of gold, which is stored in a vault in Switzerland, I believe, which is recorded on the Bitcoin blockchain or Bitcoin sidechain. And that's very much aimed in part at an institutional customer base. And I think there are going to be more and more clever and innovative products coming along, which will leverage tokenization, which are aimed at institutions. And that will bring, when the institutions come into this market, that will bring real liquidity. And that's what security tokens up until this point have lacked, I think. So I think that's the next evolution.
What's the name of that project? So people can...
One last question around that. Oh.
It's DGLD, Digital Gold.
DGLD, right. Great.
One quick last question on that is, from the institutionals, what kind of feedback do you get from them regards this? Because they've been, there's been a few reasons why they've been careful and, haven't got involved too much yet. But
yeah,
what's their feedback regards the exchange?
Well, the exchange has already dealt with institutions for a number of years. There's sovereign wealth funds and pension funds and asset managers that trade in our traditional products. So I think there's a huge amount of interest in the concept of bringing new people into the capital markets. So the idea that huge swathes of the population have never really participated in the capital markets, particularly Africa is a good example because it's sort of our home region. Until the smartphone, mobile technology sort of revolution came along, it was really not particularly conceivable for your average African investor to really participate in the capital markets because there wasn't a sort of abundance of fixed line computers, etc. But you've seen in China now something like 99% of the domestic market is retail driven. So that increase in liquidity is really beneficial for everybody, and I think the institutions are excited by the idea that there's this sort of additional pool of capital that could be attracted into the market if the infrastructure is there for them.
That's an interesting observation. I mean, coupled with the fact that I think I saw yesterday that the middle class of Africa is due to grow by at least 3 times in the next 15 years. So, not only that, but there's hundreds of millions of people moving into a sector where they may want to be investing. Yeah. So,
China's just a great example. It sort of shows you the way the world can go. I mean, the activity on the domestic exchange now for Chinese sort of equities is amazing. It's absolutely ferocious, and that's driven by 90% participation from retail. I think it's like, I can't remember the number, but the US, which is a very it's culturally a very normal thing to do to trade stocks in the US. I think they're down at something like 25% retail participation. So the idea that this technology can bring a lot of new people and a lot of activity, a lot of liquidity, it just makes the capital markets function that much better, and that's great for everybody.
Very interesting. Talking of China and innovation, maybe as a parting shot to put you on the spot, Libra. Where's it going? Is it going to help with are there adjacencies with things like what MERJ is doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of stable coins are fundamental actually to what MERJ is doing, because a lot of the magic of this technology is if you can have smart contract based executions that things are automated and the money's change hand automatically, and that you need either digitized cash or stable coins to be able to do that properly. I don't think it will be Libra. I mean, you can't argue with the fact they've got however many billion accounts, and it's very easy for them to force adoption. But I think the problem with the way this is structured is Facebook have proven themselves time and again not to be trusted with our privacy. There's been a number of examples of them breaching that trust, and I think the volumes of data that will be generated if Libra got off the ground I don't think that could be entrusted to Facebook to behave with. Is my view. That's the biggest problem I see with it. Otherwise, the structure of the currency. I mean, I know it's not what people would define as a cryptocurrency, but I don't see too many problems with it structurally. But ethically, I don't think Facebook are the guys you want behind the wheel.
Any other general news? Anything you've come across in the last few weeks which has caught your eye? Something which, apart from MERJ, obviously, something else?
Yeah, I mean, something that caught my eye, and it's probably because I'm a bit of a petrol head. But there's a guy from Oxford, a guy called Ray, who's got a business called Curio Invest, which is tokenizing rare and exotic supercars and collectible cars. I think it's a fantastic project. He's been touring around China, showcasing what he's done. He's won a number of startup pitches and awards, and I think that's a really exciting project. Definitely one to keep an eye on.
Do you see MERJ getting authorized and sort of carbon copying itself in jurisdictions that are closer to China, or Dubai, or?
So the way MERJ is structured is that they understood when they sat down and wrote the laws that people aren't going to come to the Seychelles and set up shop to become members of the exchange or to be service providers to the exchange. So the way the laws are written is that if an organization is regulated in its own jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction is one which is recognized by MERJ's regulatory framework, which is effectively IOSCO, then they can become a service provider, member, introducing broker, sponsor to MERJ under their existing licenses without setting up bricks and mortar presence in Seychelles. So that means we can integrate service providers from China, whether they be introducing brokers, members, sponsors, as long as they're regulated there, which is great. That's a very powerful piece of legislation, really, because it means we can build a global footprint quite quickly without expecting people to come and set up shop in the Seychelles. Whereas if you want to be a member of the London Stock Exchange, as an example, you need to have a presence in London.
What kind of message have you got out there to the OXBC community? How has that helped you over the last few weeks, months?
The OXBC community has been brilliant in a number of different ways, but it's firstly very supportive, and you guys are really leading the charge on that, because you're always a friendly ear and very happy to connect people when you're looking for connections. It's brought together people from all over the world who've got an interest and a shared experience in doing this course, or mainly from the course. It's, as far as I've seen, it's provided lots of opportunities. I mean, there's been lots of overlap of businesses and projects, and I just see it getting stronger and stronger, actually.
Fantastic.
Great. Brilliant.
Jim, thank you very much. And we're excited to see what's happening with MERJ, and hope it's a storming end of the year for you.
One thing I'll say, actually, just sort of tagging onto that, the OXBC network, anyone who's listening, MERJ is very keen to hear from anyone around the world that could potentially become a strategic partner to us, or an issuer, or be advising issuers, or maybe even anybody who's looking for a job in the Seychelles, because we are going to start looking for people soon, because the demand for what we can do is pretty fierce, and we're looking for good quality people.
Excellent. Great. We'll include the Seychelles job opening in very small font at the bottom of the newsletter.
Yeah.
In Winding's font.
Yeah.
So that only certain members can get access.
We need some private keys and public keys, so that.
Right. Yeah. Great stuff. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. Take care. Keep up the good
Bye.
work.